The year was 1854, when the iron wealth of New England families began pouring into private institutions that promised refinement, discipline, and futures untouched by the vulgarity of factory smoke. Carriages rattled along narrow Rhode Island lanes, wheels cutting into damp soil as they approached the iron gates of Graywick Academy. Parents gazed up at its solemn stone facade with reverence, mistaking silence for dignity, mistaking order for safety. They handed over their children with nervous pride, never sensing the slow tightening of a noose disguised as education. Within those walls, a deeper silence pulsed, a silence not of peace but of restraint, too complete, as if the building itself had learned to smother sound. Headmaster Silas Rook stood waiting at the doors, his posture rigid, his black coat falling perfectly without wrinkle, his face cut into features that seemed carved from restraint. He greeted each family with measured words, words that never wavered, words that gave the impression of authority without warmth. Parents saw in him the embodiment of discipline and trusted him blindly. They never wondered why his hands lingered on the children's shoulders too long, not with affection but with possession, as if weighing them against some internal scale. Every name spoken aloud was written carefully in his ledger later that evening, not in order of admission but by the alphabet that obsessed him, a sequence he believed contained the hidden logic of the world. To him, letters were not symbols of learning. They were instruments of order, anchors of destiny, and he had already chosen that the soil of the academy would receive them in sequence, A to Z, one by one. Graywick Academy smelled of polish and chalk, of iron stoves and candle wax, yet beneath that ordinary scent there lingered a faint trace of rot, unnoticed by the eager parents. Students entered long corridors lined with portraits of scholars who seemed to watch them with grave expectation. Each child was led to narrow dormitories where beds stood in military rows, each identical, each stripped of individuality. The children whispered their names to each other in the night, testing the comfort of belonging. But already the weight of silence pressed down on them. They felt the absence of laughter more than the presence of rules, as if joy itself had been outlawed. Silas Rook walked the halls long after midnight, his candle casting thin shadows against the walls. He paused at each bed, studying the faces of sleeping children, whispering their surnames under his breath as though reciting a litany. Adams, Barrett, Clark. The alphabet formed not just a list but a path, a script written in soil and stone, and he alone would direct its completion. He did not see children as souls to be nurtured, but as letters waiting to be arranged, lives waiting to be buried in sequence so that the world might finally be disciplined under one perfect order. This was not madness in his mind. It was devotion to a logic greater than human compassion, a ritual of silence masquerading as education. The first week passed with lessons of Latin recitation and moral instruction. Yet beneath the classroom exercises, another curriculum unfolded. Students began to notice how quickly silence was enforced. A cough during study was punished with confinement in a blackened chamber where even breath seemed too loud. A child who stuttered was forced to copy their name until the paper cut their skin, drops of blood staining the ink. Small cruelties disguised as discipline became the daily rhythm of Graywick, softening resistance, preparing them for something worse. The children did not yet know they had entered a place where the measure of their worth was not in their learning, but in the letters of their surnames. A destiny waiting patiently beneath the orchard outside, where the earth had already been measured into plots marked A through Z. Parents left convinced their sons and daughters were safe, praising the stillness of the academy, never realizing that stillness was engineered not for comfort, but for control. They saw order where there was suffocation, refinement where there was possession. As their carriages rolled back toward distant towns, the gates closed again, locking in the voices of children who would slowly learn that speaking their names aloud was dangerous. For in this place, every name was a sentence, every letter a step toward the grave, and the silence that cloaked Greywick Academy was not peace at all. It was the first act of burial. And so the academy settled into its rhythm with classes, prayers, and meals, all wrapped in the hush of obedience. Yet under this surface, the soil outside lay waiting, hungry to receive the first of many. The alphabet had begun its march, and Silas Rook, cloaked in innocence before society's eyes, sharpened his obsession with every breath. Evil here was not loud, not reckless, but calm, patient, methodical, just as he believed the world itself should be. Silas Rook was a man admired by Rhode Island's finest families. His name appeared in the society columns beside governors and clergymen, a headmaster who seemed to embody both intellect and virtue. His speeches on discipline drew applause. His manner suggested unwavering morality. Parents entrusted him with their sons and daughters as if handing them to Providence itself. Yet behind his calm, unshakable exterior, his true devotion was not to God nor education. It was to order, a private scripture written in his mind long before Greywick Academy existed. To Silas, the alphabet was not simply a tool for reading and writing. It was a sacred sequence, a code that gave shape to chaos. He believed the world itself bowed to letters, that life and death could be disciplined if arranged in perfect alphabetical procession. Children, in his view, were vessels to prove this law, each name no more than a mark in an endless script. At night, while the academy slept under its blanket of suffocating quiet, Silas sat at his heavy oak desk, the glow of a single candle casting shadows against the ledger before him. The book looked ordinary, bound in brown leather like any school record. But within it was no record of grades or attendance. Instead, every page bore a single letter of the alphabet, and under each letter he carefully wrote the surnames of the children who had come under his charge. He whispered them as he wrote, savoring their sounds as if speaking them aloud already bound them to the soil waiting outside. Adams, Barrett, Clark. He traced their names with precision, and beside each he left an empty space, a quiet place reserved not for marks of achievement but for the method of their end. This ledger was no register of progress but of fate, a preordained sequence of burials that would complete the order he believed had been missing from the world. The ledger consumed him. During lessons he appeared attentive, correcting posture, praising recitations, yet his eyes always drifted back to the children's names. He marked them not as students, but as letters that must eventually fall in line. He did not hurry. For Silas, time was his ally. Each child's destiny could wait until the order demanded it. The soil of the orchard beyond the academy had already been measured, a burial ground hidden in plain sight, divided into unseen plots that only he could read. Each grave would match a letter, each death recorded not in the chaos of accident or illness, but in the ledger's calm script. His obsession with the ledger began to shape the way he punished. When a boy named Adams dropped a slate in class, Silas made note of it, not as a simple mistake, but as a sign that the order was preparing to begin. He tested his methods quietly, pressing the child into silence for hours, locking him in a storage closet where no sound reached him. He recorded the boy's endurance with care, writing small notes in the margin of the A page. For Silas, the suffering was not cruelty but calibration, the early stages of a greater ritual that required patience. Each act of pain had to be measured, each method perfected before it was carried to its final conclusion. The ledger grew heavier with each entry. He filled its margins with symbols of timing, sketches of devices, notes on the breaking point of body and mind. Blood, he wrote once, must be drained, not spilled. Silence must be forced, not chosen. He convinced himself these were not killings to come, but lessons in purity. Only by arranging life into sequence could he reveal the hidden law of letters, the order that bound the universe. His hands trembled sometimes as he wrote, but not from fear, rather from anticipation, as though every stroke of ink brought him closer to completion. Beyond the ledger, his reputation flourished. Clergymen praised his discipline, nobles recommended his methods. He was invited to speak on moral order at gatherings of educators where he spoke eloquently about silence as the foundation of learning. None suspected that when he said silence, he thought of burial. When he said discipline, he imagined bones breaking in sequence, alphabetically arranged in the soil. The world saw in him a man of refinement. Only the ledger knew him as he truly was, a man preparing the most methodical act of slaughter Rhode Island had ever known, cloaked in the innocence of education. Night after night, the candle burned low as he turned the pages, whispering names in order, his finger tracing the empty spaces beside them. In his mind, the graves already existed, the orchard already filled. The children walked in daylight, unaware they were walking through a script already written. And as the last candle flame flickered across the leather cover, Silas closed the ledger with care, placing it back in the drawer of his desk as though it were nothing more than school records. But in truth, it was his gospel, his scripture of order, and every child at Greywick was already bound within its pages. The first to vanish was Adams, a boy of only 12 whose pale hair fell into his eyes when he wrote his lessons. A boy ordinary in every sense but one. His surname began with the letter A, and for Silas Rook that was enough. The ledger had been waiting for him, the page marked, the soil outside measured, the ritual prepared with patient hands. It happened on a rain-slick night when the dormitories were locked and silence held sway. Silas summoned Adams to the cellar under pretense of correction, leading him past rows of barrels and sacks until they reached a crude table bolted into the stone floor. Here, Rook revealed the device he had fashioned, part desk, part coffin, its surface punctured with drilled holes and its frame fitted with straps of leather. Adams was made to sit, his chest pinned with a slate as if for study, his arms bound so neatly it appeared almost like a posture exercise. Then came the mask, a glass dome fitted with a tube leading to a jar of laudanum mixed with ink, its fumes drawn up slowly by a hand pump. As the boy struggled for breath, each inhale filled his lungs with poison that burned like fire yet silenced his cries. The ink mist staining his lips, turning every gasp into a smear of black. Rook watched without malice or haste, his hand steady on the pump, his mind filled with the thought that the alphabet must have its beginning, that order demanded sacrifice. Adam's eyes widened in terror, then dulled, the ink bleeding down his chin like spilled script, his body sagging forward until the slate cracked under the weight of his collapse. Rook noted the time, the endurance, the quietness of the end, and wrote it all in his ledger before lifting the body away with ritual precision. Outside in the orchard where he had already marked the earth, he dug not in haste but with reverence, carving the first letter into the soil with his spade, shaping grave as the alphabet's foundation. He placed Adams in the earth without marker, without prayer, the boy's body lying where the sequence demanded, the soil pressed flat again so no trace remained. By dawn, the orchard looked unchanged, its rows of trees heavy with rain. But beneath it the ritual had begun, the alphabet carved invisibly into the land. In the days that followed, whispers among the children grew. Adams had gone, the bed stripped, his name spoken only in hurried breaths. Yet no alarm sounded. Silas explained his absence as illness, a letter home that parents accepted without question. The man's reputation so untouchable that no one doubted his word. The townsfolk praised the headmaster's discipline when told Adams had been sent away for correction, believing it proof of Greywick's high standards. None suspected that the boy was not in another home but beneath the very orchard they admired on Sunday visits, his name already reduced to a line in a hidden book. Silas felt no guilt, only the calm certainty of a ritual fulfilled, and his eyes turned naturally to the next page, the next letter, the next child. Barrett now walked the halls unaware that his surname bound him to a fate already decided. His every movement observed, his body weighed in Rook's cold calculations. The other children felt the shift, though they could not name it. Their silence deepened, their laughter stifled, as if some shadow pressed upon them heavier than any rule. They began to glance at each other by surname, wondering who might vanish next, though fear kept them from speaking it aloud. For Silas, the ledger was alive, its pages breathing with inevitability, and as he closed it at night, he whispered the next name into the darkness, convinced that fate was not chance but sequence, that each death was not murder but arrangement. The soil was hungry, the order was patient, and already Greywick Academy had stepped from being a place of learning into being a page of scripture, each child a letter waiting to be buried in its turn. After Adams and Barrett were swallowed by the orchard, Silas Rook grew bolder. The ledger was no longer simply a register of names. It had become a guidebook of invention, each blank space beside a surname demanding a unique method of ending. To Silas, death had to be disciplined, never repeated, never careless. Each child was not just a body but a letter, and each letter required its own ritual of silence. His methods hardened into experiments, as if cruelty itself had become a science that only he was qualified to perfect. The first of these experiments was reserved for Clark, a boy who hummed nervously when writing. Silas considered humming an insult to order, a crack in the silence he demanded. He constructed a coffin of mirrors, each pane polished to a merciless shine, fitted within a wooden box that could barely hold the shape of a child. Clark was forced inside, his body folded unnaturally, the mirrors surrounding him on every side. The child's reflection multiplied endlessly until there was no escape from his own face. Every twitch of fear, every tear was mirrored back 100 times, creating the illusion of a crowd that silently mocked his suffering. Silas left him there with only a single candle, knowing the boy would watch his own fear until madness broke him. When Clark's voice finally rose into screams, the sound bounced against the mirrored walls until it fractured into shrieks that seemed not to come from one throat but from dozens. Hours later, when silence finally returned, Silas recorded the result in his ledger with satisfaction, noting that reflection had devoured identity, leaving only order in its wake. Clark's body was buried under the sea tree in the orchard, the mirrors shattered and hidden beneath the soil to ensure no child would ever see them again. The next ritual was colder, slower, and far more deliberate. A boy named Dempsey, strong for his age, had once boasted that he could endure any punishment. Silas marked his name carefully, seeing in his pride the perfect opportunity to test endurance as a measurable quantity. Using a device inspired by early medical pumps, he created a system of glass tubes, valves, and a hand crank that drew blood not in gushes but in droplets. Dempsey was strapped into a chair, his veins tapped with crude iron needles, the pump extracting his blood drop by drop into a basin beneath him. Each turn of the crank removed not life in an instant, but strength in increments, so slowly that the boy remained awake far beyond what nature intended. Silas stood nearby, timing his breaths, counting the moments when skin lost its color, when lips went gray, when the eyes dulled yet still clung to consciousness. He whispered that silence was approaching, and the boy, too weak to answer, surrendered drop by drop until the basin was full and his body hung slack in the straps. Silas marveled at the precision of it, the blood draining with the rhythm of a clock, order imposed upon the chaos of death. Dempsey's grave was dug beside Clark's, his name sealed in the ledger as the letter D completed. The children who remained began to feel the dread creeping over them, though they could not yet articulate it. Beds were stripped quietly, names erased from attendance lists, explanations handed down in Silas's steady voice that sounded like truth. He told them of illness, of transfers, of families recalling their children, and the boys and girls accepted it outwardly. Yet in their hearts they began to fear the sequence, sensing that vanishings were not random but ordered, that surnames were dangerous in ways they could not admit aloud. Their silence deepened into a second form of punishment, one not imposed but self-chosen, as if speaking their names too often might draw the headmaster's eye. Silas, meanwhile, thrived in his hidden work. His experiments were no longer punishments, but rituals of demonstration, proofs that the alphabet was destiny, that each child's body could be shaped into evidence of order. He believed himself not cruel but enlightened, the only man willing to perform the work others dared not imagine. Each entry in the ledger tightened his conviction. Each grave filled in the orchard strengthened his sense that he was building not just a school but a scripture written in flesh and soil. The method of silence had become his gospel, and already the alphabet waited for its next offering. Greywick Academy grew heavier with each name erased. The children who remained no longer asked where their classmates had gone. The silence around them had become too dangerous to disturb, as if the building itself punished questions. Yet in the night, when the lamps were extinguished and the halls fell dark, the truth pressed back against that silence. The walls began to whisper. Some swore they heard sobs beneath the chapel floor, faint and muffled, as though buried mouths still struggled to speak through soil. Others lay awake in their dormitories, certain that the plaster itself was breathing, each inhale carrying the cries of those who had vanished. The academy was no longer only a school. It had become a vessel of grief, its stone corridors echoing with voices that should not have been there. For Silas Rook, these sounds were not hauntings but confirmations. He believed the academy itself was beginning to accept its purpose, to absorb the ritual he had given it. Every whisper that unsettled the children was, to him, the voice of order unfolding. He refined his methods with greater care, recording each in the ledger with precision. The alphabet demanded innovation, and so he created deaths that fused cruelty with discipline, each designed to silence not only the body but the very idea of resistance. Elias Fairchild, whose surname had brought him next, was chosen for the ritual of ice. Silas had long studied medical writings on the effects of cold on the human body, notes by doctors who tested endurance in the name of science. He recreated their experiments with ruthless devotion. Elias was stripped and lowered into a trough of ice water hauled from the academy well, his small chest heaving as the shock ripped breath from him. Silas observed without flinching, counting each gasp, noting the precise moment the body convulsed, the time when lips turned blue, the sound of lungs struggling against the frozen air. Elias clung to life far longer than expected, and for that endurance Silas considered him successful. An offering of silence forced through cold until the boy's body gave way and the water grew still around him. He was buried under the F-tree, his grave pressed flat as though he had never been. The trough was scrubbed, the ice scattered in the orchard, and the building returned to its unnatural quiet. Next came Godfrey, a boy whose constant chatter irritated Silas, who believed that words spoken without purpose were a threat to order. For him, silence would not be imposed by circumstance but by force. Silas crafted needles of horsehair, coarse and sharp, drawn from the brushes used to clean the academy floors. One by one he stitched the boy's lips closed, piercing flesh with slow, deliberate pressure until his mouth was bound shut. Godfrey thrashed, muffled sounds leaking through the seams of his own skin, but Silas only tightened the stitches, remarking in his ledger, how long muffled cries could last before exhaustion silenced them entirely. The boy's eyes bulged with terror, veins breaking across the whites, until finally he collapsed forward, breath shuddering through his nose as he drowned in his own panic. Silas recorded every detail, the number of stitches, the duration of muffled sound, the point at which silence was absolute. Godfrey's grave was marked in the orchard with the invisible G. The soil pressed flat once more, another letter in sequence completed. The other children felt the academy tightening around them. Nights became unbearable, with sobs rising from beneath the chapel, whispers trickling through stone. Some began to cover their ears with their pillows. Others pressed their nails into their palms until they bled just to assure themselves they were awake. They noticed the way Silas walked among them with calm satisfaction, the way his fingers brushed the backs of their necks as if already measuring their bodies for ritual. They stopped laughing entirely, stopped whispering even their names. fearing that to speak might draw attention, fearing that their place in the alphabet was already sealed. Their silence, once imposed by punishment, was now chosen by terror. And that terrified obedience gave Silas all the proof he needed that his work was righteous. To him, these were not murders but arrangements. Each ritual brought Greywick closer to its destiny, each grave another letter set into the soil. The sounds the children heard at night, the sobs, the whispers, the breathing walls, were in his eyes the voices of the order he had awakened. He walked the halls at night, candle in hand, listening with reverence, as though the building itself were speaking back to him. He whispered the next names in sequence, promising the walls that silence would always return, that each offering would deepen their bond. His ledger grew heavier with ink and with certainty. He had moved far beyond punishment. He was now conducting scripture, written not in words but in bodies, stitched into the soil of Rhode Island, one child at a time. The silence of Greywick Academy, which weighed on the children like chains, was to visitors its greatest virtue. Wealthy nobles arrived in their carriages, ministers in black coats stepped through the gates, and learned doctors walked the halls with notebooks in hand. Each came expecting refinement and found it, mistaking fear for discipline, mistaking dread for obedience. They left convinced that Greywick was a model for all schools to follow, praising its stillness, praising its perfection, never once questioning what that stillness had cost. Silas Rook received them with the same composure he gave parents, his manner steady, his words measured. He spoke of the necessity of silence in education, how discipline prepared children for the rigors of life. To ministers he invoked morality, to nobles he praised order, and to physicians he quoted science. None noticed the faint tremor beneath the floorboards when the children shifted uneasily in their beds, nor the way their eyes darted to the orchard as if unwilling to look at it too long. The visitors heard nothing but the quiet of polished halls and the soft rustle of pages. They thought themselves witnesses to learning when in truth they walked above graves. Among the guests was Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., a man celebrated for his writings on medicine, whose lectures on hygiene and discipline had spread across the nation. Silas studied him closely, not as a guest but as a prophet of justification. Holmes spoke of order in the body, of the way disease spread in undisciplined environments, and Silas twisted these words into gospel for his own ledger. If disease grew from chaos, then purity, he reasoned, grew from silence, from sequence, from the alphabetical burials he had begun. He believed Holmes had unknowingly given him permission. Scientific validation disguised as wisdom. When Holmes praised the quiet dignity of Greywick's students, Silas smiled, knowing that the man had just blessed the graves hidden beneath his shoes. The orchard swelled with letters no visitor could see. Adams, Barrett, Clark, Dempsey, Fairchild, Godfrey, all lay in their assigned places, their sequence carved invisibly into the soil. Visitors strolled the grounds after tea, remarking on the beauty of the trees, their roots already feeding on blood that had been drained, on lungs that had frozen, on lips sewn shut. No one sensed that they were walking across a hidden alphabet, each step treading on the order Silas had imposed. To the world it was a garden of refinement. To Silas it was scripture in soil, his private archive of disciplined silence. When another boy disappeared, his surname beginning with H, the visitors were told he had been recalled home by his family. Silas staged letters in the boy's handwriting, forged so neatly that even parents accepted them. He sealed them with wax, folded them with care as if deception itself were just another branch of discipline. Meanwhile, the boy had been subjected to his ritual, strapped upright in a narrow cabinet filled with fine sand that was poured grain by grain into his open mouth, until his throat filled and his lungs collapsed under the weight of silence. Silas recorded the exact measure of sand required before breath failed, then buried the child under the H-tree, smoothing the ground once more. That very afternoon, a minister strolled nearby, remarking on the orchard's serenity. The psychological toll on the remaining children deepened. They were forced to bow and greet visitors politely, their trembling mistaken for respect. They held books in their laps, recited lessons in perfect unison, each voice thin and flat like something drained of life. When a noble woman praised their composure, Silas beamed with pride, noting how even suffering could be sculpted into spectacle. The children felt the cruelty most in those moments, their silent pleas drowned under the applause of strangers. Every compliment given to Silas was a nail sealing their fates. Every nod of approval another assurance that no one would save them. Silas thrived under this double life. He was admired as a man of refinement, his school praised as a beacon of discipline. Yet every step taken by visitors above the orchard was to him a secret triumph, proof that the alphabet of graves was invisible to the world. He believed himself chosen, the only man capable of seeing order where others saw only trees. When he opened his ledger at night, candlelight flickering across the pages, he did not see crimes. He saw scripture. He saw a future where silence ruled, where graves and letters formed one perfect chain that no minister, no noble, no doctor could ever break. And as the visitors departed, their carriages rattling down the lane, Silas returned to the orchard. He pressed his hand into the soil above the latest grave and whispered the next name in line, convinced that soon the alphabet would speak for itself. By the time half the alphabet had been erased from the dormitories, Silas Rook's ledger had transformed from a book of names into a gospel of ritual. The deaths were no longer hidden punishments but ceremonies, each crafted to match the letter it represented, each arranged with symbolic weight. What began as private experiments of cruelty had become liturgy in his mind, a scripture written with bodies and sealed in soil. With every burial, he believed he was binding the world tighter, drawing chaos into submission, letter by letter. The boy whose surname began with M was chosen for the ritual of ink. Silas had long associated the letter with manuscripts and memory, with the permanence of script. He prepared a vat of thick black ink, drawn from the school's supplies but darkened with crushed soot until it seemed heavier than water. The boy was bound at the wrists and lowered head first into the vat, his face swallowed by the very alphabet he had been taught to copy each day. Struggling only quickened the suffocation, the ink forcing itself into his lungs, staining his body inside and out. The boy's small hands clawed at the rim of the vat until his nails split and floated in the black surface. But Silas only pressed him deeper, whispering that this was the perfect seal, the alphabet closing around him. When the body stilled, he pulled it free, drenched and limp, its skin stained permanently with letters that would never be written. He recorded in his ledger that silence could be sealed in ink, that the alphabet itself could suffocate a child as surely as rope or blade. The next grave belonged to a boy named Norris. Silas devised a harness of iron bars and pulleys, a crude but efficient frame he had assembled in the basement with tools intended for carpentry. Norris was strapped inside, his arms and legs drawn outward, the pulleys cranked slowly so that his bones were stretched beyond their natural span. Silas listened as joints cracked and marrow leaked, the body pulled into a shape no longer human. The boy screamed until his voice broke, then whimpered like an animal, each sound measured and written in Silas's notes. When the final crank snapped the spine, Norris fell into silence, his body twisted into the letter N itself, as if the alphabet had claimed his very form. Silas buried him beneath the orchard tree marked in his mind with that letter, convinced the earth itself had now received the alphabet's shape. The rituals grew darker with each step. For the letter O, Silas forced a boy named Oliver into a barrel, sealed the lid and rolled it in circles until the child's cries bent into whimpers, then silence. He marked it as the ritual of the circle, the endless O that consumes itself. For P, he pierced a girl's skin with dozens of quills until she resembled a page stabbed through with punctuation. For Q, a child's throat was filled with sharpened quills, the hollow shafts turning each attempt to scream into the faint whistle of air until breath failed entirely. Each ritual carried symbolic meaning, not random cruelty but deliberate inscriptions of order, a vocabulary of suffering written into the orchard one grave at a time. The children left alive no longer saw themselves as students but as letters walking toward graves. They glanced at each other with suspicion, their surnames hanging over them like sentences. They avoided speaking aloud, as if voicing their names might summon their turn. Fear pressed against their skin like weight, and the silence they lived in grew more unbearable than hunger or cold. They felt the order tightening, as if the alphabet itself were a noose slowly closing around them. Even in their dreams they saw graves shaped into letters, their own names carved into earth they could not escape. Silas, however, was at peace. The orchard had become to him a cathedral, its rows of graves aligned with perfect sequence, invisible to every visitor but alive in his eyes. He walked among the trees at night as though reading scripture, each step a recitation of a letter, each grave a verse. He believed himself not a killer but a priest of silence, ordained by order itself. When he looked back at the academy, its dark windows staring like blind eyes, he saw not a school but a vessel of ritual, a place consecrated by the alphabet he had buried beneath it. The ledger in his study no longer felt heavy with ink. It pulsed with life, each page humming with names that had been silenced. And still more letters waited. More children breathed borrowed air. Silas whispered their names under his breath as he walked the orchard, promising that soon they would join the scripture. Soon their deaths would carry meaning greater than their lives ever had. The ritual of the alphabet was not yet finished, but with every grave he dug, he was certain it was binding the world itself, letter by letter, silence by silence, until all that remained was order. By the winter of 1855, the silence of Greywick Academy had begun to leak into the town beyond its gates. Parents grew uneasy. Letters arrived irregularly, written in perfect penmanship but cold in tone, carrying none of the personality their children once had. Some families whispered of strange absences, of names fading too quickly from conversation. A few began to murmur that the academy's stillness was not refinement but something unnatural. Yet when one mother came in person demanding to see her son, Silas Rook met her at the door with calm precision. He handed her a letter sealed in wax, the script identical to her child's hand, the words warm and reassuring. She clutched it with tears in her eyes, believing the fiction, never realizing her son already lay beneath the orchard, buried in silence. Silas had perfected forgery as carefully as he had perfected death. Each absent child produced a letter in flawless script, words of love copied from older pages, adjusted just enough to sound convincing. To the parents, these letters were proof of care. To Silas, they were extensions of the ritual, false voices that masked the real work happening beneath the soil. His calligraphy became another weapon of silence, each curve of ink an erasure of suspicion, each sentence a burial in itself. He delighted in this deceit, believing the letters formed a second ledger, one visible to the world, where life continued on paper while death claimed the body. Behind closed doors, the rituals grew sharper, their cruelty aligned with letters as though the alphabet itself demanded variation. When he reached the name beginning with Q, he crafted a death that made the letter literal. The boy was forced to kneel, his throat pried open and quills were driven into the flesh, one after another, their shafts hollowing his voice. Each attempt to scream emerged as a faint whistle, a broken sound like air escaping from a dying flute. Silas observed with fascination, noting the number of quills required before breath ceased, recording in his ledger that silence could be engineered, shaped with tools of writing, the very instruments of learning. When the boy collapsed, his throat bristling with feathers, Silas whispered that the alphabet had claimed its letter and buried him beneath the Q tree, the earth absorbing both body and sound. Not long after, the ritual for R arrived. This time, Silas turned to the very tools of education, transforming them into instruments of devotion. He constructed a frame from chalkboards, nailing them together in the shape of a cross. The boy was stripped and stretched across it, his arms pinned to the boards with spikes driven through the slate, his legs bound at the base. Silas covered the boards with lines of chalk, words of order scrawled around the child's body as if scripture itself was being written in flesh. He listened to the cries that echoed across the wood, chalk dust mixing with blood, until the sound weakened into silence. He recorded it with solemn satisfaction, writing in his ledger that R had been crucified upon knowledge itself, erased in the name of order. The chalkboard frame was broken and burned in the furnace, its ashes scattered across the orchard, binding the ritual further into the soil. The children who remained lived under a dread so constant it had reshaped their bodies. Their shoulders hunched, their voices cracked, their eyes never met the headmaster's gaze. They walked the halls like shadows, their silence no longer obedience but self-preservation. They feared not only their own fate, but the certainty that every classmate was marked, that names themselves had become curses, each letter drawing them closer to the orchard. They lay awake at night, listening for footsteps in the hall, praying it would pass their bed, knowing that sooner or later it would not. Outside whispers spread faster. Parents compared letters and noticed their sameness, their unnatural perfection. A merchant claimed he had seen fewer children at the windows than before. A minister wondered aloud why Greywick's students never came home for holidays. Doubt grew in fragments, but no one dared accuse a man like Silas directly. His reputation was too strong, his calm too convincing. He continued to attend social gatherings, offering lectures on discipline and education, his voice steady, his presence reassuring. The more suspicion stirred, the more he masked it with polish, standing as a figure of order while his ledger thickened with the details of ritual slaughter. Silas lived in two worlds, one of perfect letters written in ink, the other of perfect graves written in soil. To him, they were the same scripture, two texts telling one truth. Parents believed their children lived because of the letters they held in their hands. The orchard told another story, one they could not see, one written in silence that spread beneath their very feet. Silas believed he had achieved balance, that deception and death had become partners, each sustaining the other. And as he closed his ledger at night, he whispered the next name, convinced that no suspicion, no whisper, no mother's grief could interrupt the alphabet's march toward completion. By the time the first real suspicion reached the town, Greywick's orchard had already swallowed nearly the entire alphabet. Beneath the trees, bodies lay in a sequence too precise for accident, each grave pressed flat as though the earth itself conspired in concealment. To any passing eye, the orchard seemed untouched, its branches bare in winter or heavy with fruit in autumn. But beneath its roots, a silent script spread across the soil, each letter represented by a child, each grave placed exactly where Silas Rook had measured. He alone could read it, walking the rows at night as though pacing the lines of a sacred text, convinced that the orchard had become his living manuscript. The children left alive understood what had been carved into the land, though they dared not speak it aloud. They felt it in the unnatural stillness of the dormitories, in the pattern of absence that grew with each week. They began to count themselves not by age or by lessons, but by the sequence of their surnames, each whispering prayers that some hidden mercy might break the order. Yet the order never broke. Their fear was not of chance, but of inevitability, as if the alphabet itself was the executioner and their headmaster only its hand. The psychological weight crushed them more completely than hunger or illness ever could. They walked the halls like letters already erased, each step heavy with dread that their surname would soon be called, that their breath would be measured, silenced, and buried under the next tree in line. Silas refined his rituals as the sequence advanced. For S, he created the spiral, binding a boy's body with ropes twisted until bones snapped, shaping him into the form of the letter itself. For T, he strapped a child onto a great wooden beam carved into a cross, hammering nails through wrists not as punishment but as punctuation. The letter made flesh. Each act was staged with symbolism, each death transformed into scripture that only he could decipher. To him, this was not cruelty but artistry, a discipline beyond the understanding of others. His ledger grew crowded with notes, each page filled with diagrams, timings, and reflections, until the book itself seemed to thrum with the alphabet's hunger. The townsfolk, though unsettled, remained bound by their blindness, Some began to whisper of disappearances, but they silenced themselves quickly, unwilling to accuse a man held in such esteem. A few children's letters appeared so convincing that even suspicion faltered, the perfect penmanship hiding graves with ink. Only in the hush of tavern corners or during walks home from Sunday service did the words slip out. The rumor of the Greywick alphabet. Parents spoke it only in hushed tones, a phrase too terrible to fully voice, as if uttering it might make it real. They described the vanishings as if linked to names, an order too uncanny to ignore. Yet when pressed, they denied it, ashamed of their own dread, unwilling to stain the reputation of a man the community still praised. Winter came, and with it, snow. The orchard lay buried under a sheet of white so perfect it resembled a page waiting to be written upon. To Silas, this was revelation. He walked the grounds each night, boots crunching against snow, candle flickering in the wind, seeing in the black earth beneath the whiteness the letters he had carved. The graves had become words in a language only he could read, an alphabet hidden in silence but alive with meaning. The snow was not concealment but consecration, the page upon which his scripture was finally visible. Each tree marked a letter, each grave a syllable, and as he traced the rows, he felt the orchard speaking back to him, confirming that order had triumphed over chaos. The children left alive felt the snow's weight differently. They huddled in their dormitories, staring out windows at the orchard, watching as Silas's candle moved among the trees like a phantom. To them, the snow was a shroud, hiding the bodies of their classmates, a blankness that erased their memory as efficiently as their lives. They whispered to each other of the alphabet, no longer denying it, no longer able to pretend. Some wept silently, scratching their surnames into the wood of their beds as if marking their own epitaphs before the soil claimed them. Others refused to speak at all, their silence so complete it seemed they had already died. Silas wrote in his ledger with growing urgency. He noted that the orchard had become scripture in itself, that the snow had sealed it as a page, that the sequence was nearly complete. He saw himself as more than a headmaster, more than a man. He was now the keeper of order, the priest of silence, the author of a book no one else could read. Each night he whispered the remaining names, promising the orchard their silence would come soon. Their bodies would be placed in the line, their letters sealed in earth. The town whispered of the Greywick alphabet, but dared not confront it. The children still living could no longer separate night from day, their terror unbroken, their hope long extinguished. And Silas, patient and methodical, believed the work was almost done. The alphabet was nearly complete, the orchard was nearly full, and the silence that followed each death had become so deep, so absolute that even the walls seemed to breathe with it. When Greywick Academy finally closed its doors, it did so quietly, without scandal, without mourning. Enrollment dwindled as whispers of unease spread too far to be ignored, though no parent dared accuse Silas Rook directly. The gates were locked, the dormitories abandoned, and the orchard left untended. Trees continued to bear fruit, their roots fed by the hidden alphabet of graves beneath them, but no one outside Silas understood what nourishment had sustained them. The land was eventually sold, the buildings converted into storehouses, and the orchard treated as nothing more than farmland. No marker was ever raised, no prayer ever spoken. The names of the children vanished as efficiently as their bodies had, absorbed into silence. Silas himself faded into obscurity. He left no dramatic confession, no outburst of guilt. He died with the calm dignity he had always presented, buried in a churchyard among men of standing. To the community, he remained a man of refinement, a headmaster who had brought discipline to a generation. His ledger was hidden among his papers, locked in a drawer that was sealed when his estate passed to distant relatives. No one thought to open it then. The truth lay dormant, buried as deeply as the children he had placed in the orchard, his scripture waiting for a future eye to read it. Decades passed before that drawer was broken open. In the early years of the 20th century, archivists cataloging old estates stumbled across the ledger. At first glance, it seemed an ordinary record book, but its contents revealed a horror too exact to dismiss. Every page was marked with a letter. Every letter matched to a name, and beside each name was a detailed description of method, duration, and burial. It was not wild confession, not incoherent madness, but careful notation, precise in timing and measurement. Scholars who studied it felt ill as they turned the pages, realizing that what lay before them was not an accident of cruelty, but a system. Each death had been recorded as if it were data, as if children's lives had been reduced to numbers in an experiment of silence. The ledger became known in whispers as the Greywick Record. Though most of its pages were never published, its existence leaked into the public, and the shock it produced rippled through Rhode Island society. Questions were asked about how so many children had disappeared without consequence, how silence had been mistaken for discipline, how a community had praised order while graves multiplied beneath their feet. Lawmakers seized upon the outrage. Inquiries into boarding schools followed. Rules of oversight were written, and new child welfare protections began to take shape. Inspectors were assigned to institutions that once had gone unobserved. The name Greywick was never printed widely, but the shadow it cast forced reform. The orchard was plowed under, the land resold, the buildings eventually torn down. But the ledger's existence had ensured that what had been buried in silence would not remain wholly forgotten. For the families, however, there was no closure. Most had gone to their graves themselves, never learning the truth, still believing their children had been transferred or lost to illness. For those who survived to see the ledger exposed, the knowledge was unbearable. To know that their sons and daughters had been erased not by chance but by sequence, buried not by fate but by order, was a weight too heavy to bear. Some refused to believe it even when shown the evidence, preferring the comfort of lies to the cruelty of truth. Others demanded memorials, but few were built. The graves remained unmarked, the orchard unremembered, the soil still holding its secrets. Silas's mind, reconstructed from his ledger, revealed a philosophy that chilled those who studied it. He had believed order was greater than life, that silence was greater than love, that the alphabet itself demanded sacrifice. Evil had hidden not in chaos but in neatness, not in violence that shouted, but in rituals too calm to question. The world had been willing to accept discipline as virtue, silence as proof of learning, order as evidence of morality. And in that willingness, children had been lost. The story of Greywick closed with silence, but its legacy was one of warning. Evil often hides in systems that appear too neat, in rules that seem too logical, in silences that are mistaken for peace. What happened in the orchard was not madness but method, not frenzy but patience. And it is that patience that makes the story unbearable, for it forces us to ask not only how it happened then, but whether it could happen again. What do you think? Could order itself become a mask for cruelty once more? Could silence become a weapon again, consuming the voices of the innocent while the world looks on and praises discipline? The orchard may be gone, but the question remains.